This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development, providing graduate-level education to working professionals, online, on campus, and on-site. For more information, please visit study.stanford.edu.
This week we have Joseph Kaye from Cornell, and he is finishing his dissertation there, and being young and, should I say unwise or whatever it is, he's tackled a hard problem. Right? So most of us in HCI know that once you get beyond the sort of obvious like productivity measures, it's really hard to evaluate HCI solutions, to know what you can measure. And he's young enough not to know that it's so hard that it's impossible, so therefore he's going to do it. So his talk is about evaluation in interesting new ways that aren't the old traditional ones.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Terry. That's entirely spot on. I could really go home now, you know. It's awfully hard. And the other thing I found interesting is how much it seems to offend people when you talk about this stuff. So with any luck, we'll get people who will be offended, and then we can have some really interesting discussions, because that's always a good sign. All right, let's dive in. When you start talking about evaluation, one of the things that happens early is you feel this bizarre need to define it. It's one of these things that people do, and they get really nervous, and then they claim, well, that's not evaluation, it is not evaluation. And often one of the things that's helpful is to take a step back and realize that when we're talking about evaluation in HCI, we're talking about a very special notion of evaluation. And if you talk to non-HCI people, I want to emphasize that when I mean non-HCI people, I don't mean computer graphics people, right? I don't mean people who do HCI that you don't like. I mean when you talk to sort of sociologists, and I don't mean sociologists of technology. I mean like real, honest-to-God sociologists with big beards, right? And they're like, and, you know, you say you're working on evaluation. They're like, oh, interesting. What is that? And you're like, well, when you build a piece of technology, you have to evaluate it. And they're like, really? Why? All right. So this notion of evaluation is kind of, it's not something that's ubiquitous. Right? This notion of evaluation is something that's developed over time, and we talk about it as being part of the design, build, evaluate, iterative design cycle, right? But one of the things that helps is to sort of queer this notion of evaluation a little bit, right? And realize that this is not necessarily the default way of things. And that's kind of where I want to start from. Evaluation is a place in which you can compare what you've built to what you intended to build, right? What you intended to build. It's a chance to sit down and look back on what you've done. Okay, all of this stuff is sort of reasonable. One of the other points is that evaluation is the point in which, in HCI, in which we define that what we've done is research, right? You cannot submit a paper for publication right now unless you've got an evaluation component. You know, you can try and submit something in this, you know, crazy new idea that you've had, that you've built, that you've actually, you know, gone and built and implemented. There are conferences where you can submit that, but HCI conferences are generally not one of them, right? It's become a fundamental part of the field, and in many ways, it's how we define the field. In the evaluation is this opportunity to say, yes, this is actually the field. This is it. This is what we do. And it's because of that it's the way that the discipline validates the knowledge it creates. We create knowledge, and we have to say, well, we've created this knowledge. We think such and such. We think computers work better when they're blue or green or red, and we can validate that knowledge one way or another. So, yes, it's also something that you do at the end of a project to show that it works, right, so that you can publish it. But that itself feeds back into this notion of defining the field. All right. You may have seen something like this. This is from the Kaye 2007 website, and it's about validity, right? And it's about how you show that your work is valid. I don't know whether you've ever done a little experiment, which is you take this and you show it to someone else who's, say, a biologist, right? Or someone who works on pharmaceuticals, say, or a structural engineer, and you say, well, in my field, we have to validate our work. And they say, oh, we have to do that in our field as well. And they've often got a very short list, a very, very short list of how you prove something works, right? And people agree on them. Or that's how it looks from the outside. And I think if you're actually in the field, it's probably more contentious. Look at this list, right? Look at this list. You can validate stuff by doing work in the laboratory or in the field, Well, that kind of covers a lot of ground to begin with, right? You can show what your design rationales are, right? You can show your applications of your analytical techniques. You can do proof of concept system implementations. This is a very wide list, right? The point is you need to validate it. We're not really quite sure how. All of these sound like a good guess, right? And so looking at this made me realize, well, how did we get to this stage? How did we end up with the systems that we use for evaluation right now? How did we end up with this particular approach to doing things? And in particular, there seems to be an increasing body of work on experience-focused HCI, right? People working on HCI that's not about the task. It's not that everyone's doing this. It's not that it is the next wave. It just seems to be a particular body of work. And I consider myself one of the people who's doing that. And I keep getting my papers rejected. And I don't think that's fair, right? And when I look at the reasons why my papers keep getting rejected, one of the problems is they say, oh, well, you didn't evaluate it properly because, you know, you didn't have sufficient N. That's always the good one, right? When I always know when I didn't have sufficient N that there's something going on. And what's going on there is this paradigm clash about what is appropriate evaluation. So I wanted to study that carefully. The place where this became first relevant to me was a project called particularly relevant to me, was a project called the Virtual Intimate Object, or the VIO. This stuff I've been talking about for a couple of years now. I was in a long-distance relationship. My girlfriend at the time lived in LA, and I wanted to stay in touch with her. And in particular, I wanted to stay. I mean, we were sort of phoning each other and things like that, and every so often we'd use a webcam and things like that. But there was sort of, when you're living with someone, you can have these little intimate moments, right? That just sort of like brushing past them on the way to the fridge, right? That sort of thing. And that sort of small scale of intimacy, right? And that was what we were missing. That was one of the things we felt was a real missing from this long-distance relationship. So I tried to build the simplest possible thing to solve the solution. Did a lot of ethnographic work, talked to a lot of people, interviewed lots of couples in long-distance relationships, and we came up with this, the virtual intimate object. It's a little dot. It sits in your taskbar, right? You've got one. Your partner's got one. There's a Mac version. It sits in your dock, right? When you click on your dot, your partner's dot turns bright red, and then it fades over time. So what you can see there is that fading over time. It initially fades pretty fast, like in the first 10 minutes it fades several colors, and then that rate of fading slows down, and at the end of 12 hours after you've clicked it, it goes completely transparent. So they can look at it and they have a vague idea how long it's been since you last clicked. Then they can click back, right? So it works the same way. They click on theirs, yours turns bright red, fades over time. You can also, if you want, move your mouse over it without clicking, and you can see what the current state of your partner's of your partner's dot is. That's all it does. It's very, very simple, right? And it's nice, because the nice thing about something this simple is you can get the usability right pretty quickly. And the usability is very, very important, but you've got to get the usability right. Once you've got the usability right, then you can play around with evaluating it. You can play around with saying, well, how do we know if people like it? So we asked people, did you like it? They said yes. I'm like, oh, now what? Can't really publish that, can we? So and so we tried a whole bunch of different methods. And that's one of the things that I'll go into is what we came up with. And we found that we were measuring intimacy, right? We had to measure, we claimed that this device transmitted intimacy. So were we supposed to count intimacy? This is my favoriteest slide. This is Ariel, the little mermaid, right? She's in a long-distance relationship with Eric, the manly, princey man, right? So she's sort of all dreaming of being with Eric. And you can see that in this coloring book, you've got all the hearts around this. How much does Ariel love Eric? Count the hearts. And the best thing about it, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but the best thing about it is that down here it says answer, 19. So, Ariel loves Eric 19 hearts. Brilliant! Because that means, of course, that if they were using the VIO and we only were able to transmit, say, 14, 15 hearts, right? Then we upgraded it and they got up to 16 hearts, we'd be like, it's a heart better, right? We don't know how to do this. This is the problem. All right, let's go back to this. So, how can you evaluate something like this where it's ineffable? We don't know how to talk about it. We don't have good ways to measure this stuff. Now, some people may believe that you can in fact measure intimacy, that you can measure love, that there is some numeric way of doing this. I happen to not believe this, and this may be one of those big sort of fundamental questions. It doesn't mean that and when I say measure it, I'm perfectly happy with finding ways to talk about it. I'm just not convinced that counting it on a scale of 1 to 7, say, is necessarily the right way to do this. But we did come up with some other things. All right, let me go into what I'm going to talk about in this talk. I want to go back to sort of a historical approach and talk about some stuff that led up to where we got to where we are today with the current systems of evaluation. And in particular, I want to go into 3 different things. And I just noticed this the other day, how wonderful PowerPoint gave me sub-values of A with a dot after it, A with a bracket, and then numbers. I don't, if you tried to make it do that, you could never do it. But I was utterly delighted. I want to go into a couple of special things that I think will give us some insight. I want to talk about text editors and how that happened. I want to talk about a big controversy that happened called the damaged merchandise controversy. And then I want to talk about a couple of projects I've done recently, mainly not because there are not other people doing this stuff, but if I do my stuff, then I can pick on it and point out where it's wrong and when I've been really stupid, and I feel bad about doing that to other people's stuff. So, for each one of these errors, each one of these areas of, each one of these paradigms, each one of these times at which people were evaluating different stuff, I want to talk about 3 questions. I want to talk about who the users are, I want to talk about who the people doing the evaluation are, and I want to talk about what the limiting factor is. And I found that these 3 questions give you a way to say, yes, this is a particular sector of time. Now, those are very useful questions, and they give you a way to quickly grasp and characterize what's going on. It's a massive oversimplification, and this is one of the things that I've realized, that historians are perfectly happy to let you get away with this stuff. When I give this talk to sort of science and technology studies people, they're happy about this. And it's sort of assumed, and I think we don't necessarily assume the same thing in HCI, and that's that I'm going to talk about a large chunk of time as if it existed as a large chunk of time, as if everybody agreed about what was going on and if everyone got on. There's always dissent, there's always argument within the field, right? But let's talk about this in a sort of historical voice, and it'll give us this way to talk about this. So, let's jump in. We're talking, let's start, say, just post-World War II, right? We've got first computers going around, and people who look like this are doing lots of engineering stuff. That's actually my uncle. I just like the photo. And we've got these engineers, we've got these mathematicians, and they're doing the work and they're evaluating. Often the same people who are building the hardware are actually using it, right? You've got a very close intersection here, and the limiting factor is reliability. If you go back to John von Neumann's report on ENIAC from 1948, I think, he talks about, it's a relatively short report, and he talks about reliability something like 8 or 9 times. It keeps coming up as the reliability problem. We've got this problem of reliability. And the reliability problem was that your computer would stop working, right? You'd be going along doing stuff, and a vacuum tube would blow, and then you'd have to go and replace it, and then you'd sort of keep going. I'm pretty sure all computer science departments worth their salt have this dusty display case somewhere with a vacuum tube puller. Do you have one of those around? I noticed there was a...
We have a dusty display cases. I'm not sure.
I don't know if there's a vacuum tube puller. There's probably one around somewhere, right? They developed specialized hardware to pull out the vacuum tubes because they're hot, right? And then you put in another one, and then you sort of try and keep doing what you were doing. This was the big problem, right? You ran into problems with reliability all the time. And the limitation on people accomplishing what they needed to do was that the computer would break after 15 minutes, right? So they worked on that for a bit, and they got it right. And we started to see something that looks more like a computer scientist. Does anybody know who this person is? I promise it's not my uncle this time.
Grace Hopper.
It is Grace Hopper. Well done. It's always interesting to see whether people get that one. So we start to see people who look like programmers, who look like computer scientists, look like something that we really recognize. And both the users and the evaluators, again, are often programmers, the people who are sort of measuring the stuff and the people who are doing this stuff. But what turns out to be the limiting factor here is the speed of the machine. And this is when people start talking in eventually megahertz and eventually gigahertz, right? And when you buy a new computer nowadays, it'll tell you how many megahertzes it's got, how many gigahertzes it's got. And it's a bit strange when you think about it, because it's often not really the limiting factor on what we do. It's important. I don't knock it. And there are definitely times, if you're doing some research project and you're calculating some big support vector machine to recognize this then yes, okay, then the speed of the machine is the limiting factor. And this continues to be a very pervasive way of thinking about evaluating computers, right? But it's now often not the limiting factor on what people are trying to do. And perhaps the best example of this is when we go out of things that look like computers and into things that look like this. I don't know how many gigahertzes this has got, right? When I buy a new one, they don't try and tell me it's better because it's got more gigahertzes than the other one that I used before, right? And I think that's something where we've actually finally managed to get out of this particular paradigm of thinking about stuff by moving on to a next stage. Now let's move to we're talking the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s here, and we're seeing a bunch of experimental psychologists and cognitive scientists coming in, and they start to invent something that looks like human-computer interaction, right? This starts off, I guess, 1976. There was a workshop run by a guy called Siegfried Trau at SIGGRAPH, which started to talk about these issues of actually having users doing this stuff, right? Then it sort of went, it looks like it went dormant for a bit and then starts up in the beginning of the 80s. And we have the founding of Kaye and the founding of HCI as a discipline. Now, those words go back a bit earlier. I mean, I found, if you go back through the ACM Digital Library, you can sort of beat it with a stick and you can go back and there's people talking about human-computer interaction in 1965, 1967, dates like that. But it's a very rare occurrence. Usually people talk about man-machine communication. That's like the big thing. And there's some evidence that when when this group of people met and started talking about this, they were saying, well, okay, we actually deliberately want gender-neutral language here. We don't want to talk about man-machine communication. More detail. So we're starting to see something that looks like a user. I know we're not supposed to use the word user anymore in HCI, because otherwise, Natalie Jeremyjenko, for some reason, is really adamant about this. And given that she's not really an HCI person, but she really will like chase you down and beat you with a stick if you use the word user. James Lander being, yes. But the people that we're starting to see here really look like users. They're using, and interestingly, they're using the computer as a tool to do what they're trying to do, right? They've got some particular task they're trying to accomplish. And so that's the situation. We've got the people evaluating, and they're experimental psychologists, they're cognitive scientists. They've got this background in measuring what humans do. They're very, very good at measuring what humans do. They've done psychophysical experiments, and you're seeing a lot of stuff around this time about optimal display patterns. How long before, when you move a mouse, how long until you actually see it on the screen moving? How much of a delay are you allowed to have there, right? What sort of psychophysical parameters have we got to work with? And that's because the limiting factor is starting to become what the human can do, right? The computer is waiting for the human rather than the human waiting for the computer. At least some of the time. It may feel like the human ends up waiting for the computer a lot of the time. But when you sort of actually look at this and actually figure out what's going on, you've got these big time-sharing computers, right? Where you have a computer that's waiting for 200 humans most of the time. And that becomes the focus of what's going on. So when the focus becomes what the human can do, you've got a whole field called human-computer interaction that comes out of that. Here's a nice little example. Teresa Roberts and Thomas Moran. Teresa Roberts was at Berkeley, I think. I think it was Berkeley, doing her PhD. And she decided to come up with a method for evaluating text editors. Because this was one of the big questions, was what text editor should I buy? Should I go and buy a Wang word processor? Should I go and buy a CPM machine that I could run WordStar on? Should I buy one of these newfangled kind of Apple II thingies? Should I go and buy, there was lots of debate about what to buy, and there was no clear answer. So the idea was, well, why don't we come up with a series of things that we can compare all the existing text editors with, and then when someone comes up with the next new text editor, we can compare that to the existing ones. So we've got this established system. And they said that we've got 3 ways of doing this, 3 things that are important. And those 3 things are objectivity, thoroughness, and ease of use. Now, what they mean by these are some very specific things. By objectivity, they mean if you're evaluating a text edit, let's say you're used to Emacs, right? And Emacs has certain features. Let's say search and replace. Not every, you may not have search and replace in the same place in every particular text editor. But you can't assume that Emacs has the right place for search and replace, and you've got to compare everything to Emacs. That's what they meant by objectivity. By thoroughness, they meant that you've got to be able to go through everything, right? And in particular, they meant that, let's say a particular computer had spell checking. Spell checking was, some text editors had it, some text editors didn't have it. If something actually had spell checking, you had to include that as part of the evaluation. You couldn't just say, well, We're just going to compare off the things that everyone's got in common. And ease of use. Now, ease of use, they're not talking about the text editor here. They're talking about the ease of use of the evaluation of this evaluation methodology that they're developing, right? They want something this methodology where you can go in and somebody else can use this methodology to evaluate a new system. And notice what they say here. This methodology should be usable by editor designers, whoever those people are, editor designers, managers of word processing centers, or other non-psychologists. This is radical, right? They're building a system that's so simple that even non-psychologists can use it. Now this tells you something about the assumptions about what's going on, in this field. I love this quote. Thomas Green, Jonathan quotes this in his 1990 paper. Text editors are the white rats of HCI. What I love about this quote is that Thomas Green thinks he's talking about text editors, and I think he's talking about HCI, right? This tells you what the assumptions are in the field, right? This is the way that the world works. We can talk about white rats, and that's a standard of comparison, and everyone understands what you mean by that. So, then we've got something interesting that happens. There's a group of people, often these are people who are in fact experimental psychologists or cognitive scientists, but they've made a decision that they want to switch to doing usability. They may still be in a research environment, but they're starting to believe in something that's different to what the experimental psychologists believe in, right? They've got users who are often in office jobs, often building stuff, right? And the worker is trying to accomplish their task, and it's how can you make that process most efficient? So the big difference is that these people don't necessarily need to prove everything. If they can do something and say, well, clearly this is the correct result, I have got significant expertise. So Jacob Nielsen comes along and says, expertise counts. We can talk about expertise, and it makes a difference whether you have an expert evaluator or an evaluator off the street, a novice evaluator evaluating something. And if you compare this to a sort of experimental psychology approach, it's not supposed to make a difference who's doing it, right? So this is a big change, and it's a difference in changing about what it means to think about this stuff. So they want an end result that works, whether or not they can prove it experimentally. So let's go into this big debate that came around this. A foreword, and I'm going to say this afterwards as well. I'm presenting this debate because I think it's interesting historically. What I'm not trying to suggest is that one of these two groups is correct, right? I'm presenting this in a sort of, as if I don't know what the right answer is, right? It's sort of this very science and technology studies critical way of doing this. So a little disclaimer to begin with. Let's set this up. Early 80s, usability evaluation methods, right? People are coming up with different approaches for doing usability. Someone says, oh, I've invented this thing called GOMS. Anybody know what GOMS stands for? What does the S stand for? Selection. We got 2 selection rules. That's good. Often people get all of them except for the last one. I can think it's sneezy or something, like people start guessing wildly. So people come up with these different approaches to evaluating it, right? So you've got Nielsen comes up with his heuristics. There's cognitive walkthrough, there's GOMS, there's a whole handful of these. And the question then comes, well, which one of these should you use? So a whole bunch of people go and publish papers, and they basically all have roughly the same methodology, which is we take a particular program, and okay, everybody on this side of the room, you're going to evaluate it using Nielsen's heuristics. Everyone on that side of the room, you're going to evaluate it using GOMS. And then at the end of the day, we're going to see which one of these came up with more problems, right? So we can do this, and we can do this a couple of different times in a couple of different ways, and come up with the right answer, which is the system we should be using. Then Wayne Gray came along and he said, well, I don't really like what's going on. He says, put together a panel at Kaye called Discount or Disservice, Discount Usability Analysis at a Bargain Price, or Simply Damaged Merchandise. Right, in case you don't get it, this is like sort of starting a fight, right? And he says, all of you are doing lousy science. This is, bad research, and this research really matters, so it's not fair that if it didn't matter, it wouldn't matter that you're doing lousy science, but this is really important, and you're doing lousy science. Big fight. Everybody says, so they say, okay, look, take it outside. Just take it outside. So they take it to a special issue of HCI a couple of years later, Experimental Comparison of Usability Evaluation Methods. And in this issue, it starts off, Wayne Gray and Marilyn Saltzman, his collaborator, put together this paper in which they go through all of those studies and they point out what's wrong with them. And they're all wrong for various ways. They go back to Cook and Campbell 1979, and they talk about the different ways in which you can do science badly. They say, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. Then the other half of the issue is the replies. So they get a whole bunch of people to reply. And people have all sorts of different replies to it, right? So let's see, Wendy McKay says we should triangulate. We should have different approaches and then all sort of converge on the same thing. Bonnie John says we should do more case studies. That's what we need to do. Helen Jeffries says we should do more real-world studies of things, not these sort of academic laboratory things. William Newman says we should model everything, right? Everybody has these different approaches to this, right? And everyone has different answers. So what I think we're really seeing here is this idea of a paradigm clash. I don't want to go into full sort of... Paradigm is sort of a pity word that's difficult to use now because it's sort of got a bit abused in the last... About 5 years ago, right, there were all these big companies who were like, I'm in the business of paradigm switching, you know, and you're like, oh, stop it. There is actually some real content here. There's a book called The Study of Scientific Revolutions, which if you're building technologies, you probably want to read, by a guy called Thomas Kuhn. And he talks about this as being one of the standard patterns that happen. You have a bunch of people who have one approach for doing stuff. You have a bunch of people who have a second approach for doing stuff, right? And one of the things that's happened that's important to recognize, Wayne Gray was right. A lot of these people were doing pretty bad science. This was stuff, and you know, a lot of his comments were entirely correct. And one of the problems was that the people who were doing the bad science didn't believe in the same things he believed in. And what they were trying to do was do research from this new paradigm in the style of the old paradigm, right? You're trying to present your work to the dominant paradigm in the field. You don't go in and say, okay, we're going to do everything my way. No, what you do is you go into the existing paradigm in the field and you say, all right, I'm going to try and present my work in the way of this previous work. And you can see this happening in physics with, you know, different models of the atom. And these different models of the atom, and you start off with the basic Niels Bohr model where you have sort of a nucleus and then things circling around it. And then someone says, well, actually the data doesn't fit. I keep having these things that look like atoms are actually not just in spheres, but they have sort of bulbs and they're sort of weird. And eventually the data gets overwhelming, but you spend this long time trying to fit your data, trying to fit your way of presenting stuff into the way of the previous paradigm. Yep. So it's not about who's right. It's not about presenting work, but it is about this idea of presenting work in the dominant paradigm of the field. And it's about recognizing paradigm clashes in HCI. Because when you can recognize, oh, what's going on as a paradigm clash, it's a lot easier than thinking all of my reviewers are idiots. And often it feels like all my reviewers are idiots, but usually they're not idiots. Sometimes I've got to say the reviewers are just idiots. There's nothing you can do about it, but recognizing this and being able to talk about this, I think, is a sort of useful thing. So where I see this coming out is in an area that I'm referring to as experience-focused HCI. Experience-focused HCI says, all right, we've got these people out there and they're using technologies. And they're using technologies to accomplish certain tasks, but it's not about the task. It may include the task, but it's not about the task. And if we evaluate just in terms of the task, then you're missing out on a big picture of what's going on. You can't just say, oh, we know how to measure this, so we're going to go and measure this particular thing here, right? This is the whole sort of the usability lamppost. There were some nice arguments at Chi Fringe 2003 where Henry Lieberman railed against the tyranny of evaluation, and Showman Zai said, yeah, well, it's better than everything else we've got out there. So they had a big fight, but there was this idea of the usability lamppost. Are you familiar with this? Okay, the standard joke is, you know, you're walking down the street and then there's this drunk guy who's looking for his keys. Looking for my keys, apparently. The drunk guy is looking for his keys, and you're like, you know, what's up? He's like, have you seen my keys? And you're like, no, I haven't. Where did you drop them? And he's like, I dropped them over by my car. Well, why are you looking here, under the lamppost? Because that's where the light is, stupid. Right? It's often easy to look for your keys where the light is, and this is one of the problems that can happen with just looking at the tasks. It's easier to evaluate the task. It's easier to measure the time on the task. And then say, well, we've evaluated it. Well, there might be a whole bunch of stuff that's happening not under the lamppost, right? And that's what I think is happening with this area of experience-focused HCI. It's drawing in from other disciplines that have perhaps more familiarity with areas outside. It's not that the stuff that the task is not important, and I always get beaten up for this, but it's really not that the task continues to be a very important thing. It's something you've got to evaluate. But thinking about how you can go beyond that and talk about a bigger picture. I've been thinking about this in terms of, if you think about what people do with blogs, if you say, well, is it the duration of time it takes, how do you measure a new blogging tool? Does it let you blog faster? Well, I'm not sure. Is it the task of blogging? Or is it something more complex about the presentation of self in everyday life out to the world through the medium of the blog? Cars are a nice example of this, right? If you look at cars, particularly sort of custom cars stuff, if you ever, these were a series of pictures, when I was working at Intel, I went off to this Hispanic culture fair in Twin Falls, Idaho, and it turned out to be all lowrider cars. And I just thought it was fascinating in thinking about, here's this piece of technology. I particularly mean I've been spending the whole summer working on smart homes, and working on smart homes can be a bit depressing because a lot of the stuff is not really very interesting. I mean, I guess I've told everybody now. But really, a lot of smart home stuff is not very creative, it's not very exciting. And there were these people who were doing cars in this exciting and fascinating way. I was like, okay, there are ways to take a piece of technology and modify it and think about it in some very exciting ways. So, I mean, when I think about, I'm a grad student, right, so I drive a grad student car. It's a 1987 Saab 900 convertible. It's older than about half my students right now, which I feel is a certain accomplishment. It's battered, but I love it. It's great, and it's definitely sort of a certain aesthetic. There's the people driving a Prius have a very, yes, there is sort of economic reasons to drive a Prius, but there's also sort of the aesthetics, right? And there's also the fact that, it's much more impressive to your friends, and if you show up driving some big SUV thing and everyone kind of looks at you like this. Conversely, there are people who want to show up driving a big SUV thing because it talks about the way that they experience this task of driving, right? So, this is tricky. I tried to apply my users, who are the users, who are the evaluators, and what are the limiting factors thing. And I found it's much harder when you're actually in the field. Like, it's much easier to say this about other people. But let's give it a go. The users are everybody using technology in everyday life. And I always hate, whenever anyone tells you that the users are everybody, they're usually lying. Right? It's always sort of a good rule, but let's leave it for now. And what I think is interesting is this trend I'm seeing with the evaluators being people who have cultural expertise in interpreting experience. Right? So we're seeing much more influence from anthropologists and ethnographers. We're seeing documentary filmmakers. We're seeing playwrights coming in. We're seeing writers and thinking about the use of technology not just being this task-focused notion, but also being culturally embedded. And I haven't decided what I think the limiting factor is. I think in some cases, for some technologies, you can talk about the limiting factor being the ability to express yourself out to the world. That's clearly important. Again, in a lot of the blog stuff, you can talk about that. If you look at sociological studies of cell phone use, for example. Do you know about lecking behavior? Do you know about lecking behavior? Lecking behavior is a habit, is a way that moose, I think, show how that they attract women. Basically, you have these big male moose, and they sort of walk around with their big antlers, and they kind of rub them against stuff. And there are these very recognizable patterns of attracting female moose through lecking behavior. And there's this sociologist who did a study in England, and she noticed that men use cell phones in a lecking behavior kind of way. So they come in, and they sort of come into the pub, right, and they sit down, and they put their cell phone down on the bar. And like the shinier and newer the cell phone is, the more they're likely to do this. And single men are much more likely to do this, right? So there are these sociological aspects of technology that it's never worked for me, I've got to say, but maybe I need it. Maybe I need a new cell phone. I don't know, but it's not. I mean, I've got to ask my girlfriend whether she was attracted by my cell phone. I don't think so. I don't think it sort of came up in conversation. But thinking about this, let's move on. You know, it's bad when you start talking about your girlfriend in talks. So, let's go back to the VIO and treating this as evaluating an experience-focused HCI project. What we did was come up with basically cultural probes. And one of the scariest talks I've ever given in my life was at Microsoft. They had a little a meeting called Less is More, sort of party thrown for Bill Buxton kind of thing. And it was, I got to present this work about doing cultural probes for evaluation, and Bill Gaver was sort of sitting front and central, and I've never been more, because like, Bill can be, I mean, I really like working with Bill, but he can be pretty scathing. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, I want to tell you two things. First thing is that was very good. And the second thing, and this is completely unrelated, can I borrow £10, please? So I think it went well, basically. Anyway, what we did was basically give people, we combined a diary study with a cultural probe, right? We took the idea of doing sort of open-ended questions that made people think about stuff. And over time, we've developed a list of what the right sort of questions to ask are. It really helps if you have open-ended questions, right? If you say things like, how many times did you use it today? Boom. You very rarely get very interesting results. If nothing else, suffix the word why on every question you ask. They'll ignore it half the time. It's okay. User interpreted. Take the data and go back through with them, right? Ask them defamiliarizing questions. And this turned out to be a really powerful thing. We have certain normal ways of thinking about how we use a technology. So, such as, I used my cell phone 6 times today. And if you were, filling out a logbook about cell phone use, you'd expect to get asked, how many times did you use your cell phone today? And it wouldn't be very interesting. If instead we found we got great leverage from asking questions, so this particular thing was about couples in long-distance relationships. We got great leverage from asking questions like, what color is your relationship today, right? If somebody made a movie about your life, who would it be and why? For family stuff, we found like asking, what TV family does your family most resemble and why? And that one's interesting because the answer is always the same. It's always The Simpsons. I'm yet to have any family that comes up with anyone else, which is, it helps to ask about the situation ask about the situation impacted by the technology. So we're building a technology for a purpose. We're not just building this technology for no reason at all, but we're building it to impact a particular situation. So in this case, for example, we were building it to impact couples in long-distance relationships. So we didn't just ask about technology, but we asked about the long-distance relationship as well as the technology. And that the last bit, that leverage designers and users' skills in lay cultural interpretation, that's when you ask, what movie director would direct a movie about you driving your car, right? You get a very rich story from them, because then they're sort of forced to defamiliarize, but they have expertise in movie directing, right? You can recognize certain movie directors. Maybe you don't have a share group. Maybe that question doesn't work for them, right? Not everybody knows enough movie directors to be able to answer that kind of question. But throwing this stuff out there, and then you sit down and do the user interpretation. You sit down with them, and you go back through the data. Turns out to be very powerful, particularly when you then correlate it with real quantitative data. If you've got log data, right, where you can actually say, well, it looks like you used it in this pattern, and crossover by going back between them. Yeah, these are the things I just told you about. So here's some nice examples of the color stuff. I'm not used to having 16 different screens. It's great. It's super. And I love the. We thought asking what color is your relationship was just sort of a throwaway line, and it turned out we got these very thoughtful discussions about whether they were sort of blue or yellow or purple, and the ways that people were going, and particularly people who are having problems with their relationships. It gave them a way to talk about it there in a way that they sort of felt safe doing. I think this amber red thing, do I proceed with caution or speed up to beat the red or slow down anticipating a step? They did write step and not stop, we think, but. So one of the people who I think is doing this stuff, as mentioned, is Bill Gaver. He's now at Goldsmiths, and he's got a paper that I would highly recommend that I would expect most of you probably haven't seen yet, called Cultural Commentators for Polyphonic Assessment. And I think it may actually have appeared in IJHCI. Nobody's quite sure about, including Bill, is quite sure about whether it's actually come out yet or not. The basic idea is saying what you want to do is take a bunch of people with cultural expertise and apply them to this particular problem, right? When people are using technology in a cultural context, you need to evaluate it in a cultural context. You need to work with people who have expertise in doing this. So, for example, Bill, my advisor Phoebe, Toby Kerridge, and John Bowers built a system where we basically put a ubiquitous computing system into a house in North London. We spent a lot of time building sensors that we felt would be privacy preserving. So we wanted sensors that would make people not say, for example, we were interested in how many people are in the house. And one of the things that came up was that one of the ways that you can do that is count the number of showers. And that gets you roughly proportional number of people in the house if you count the number of showers in the morning. So the obvious way to do this is to put a camera in the bathroom, right? Well, okay, there's a bit of a problem. And you know, there are a bunch of systems out there where people have various cameras, and they're like, oh, well, the camera is only ever seen by a computer. We just count with the computer. You know, don't worry, nobody's actually watching you in the bathroom. There's some real questions about trust there. There's some questions about security, some questions about privacy. Instead, we found that it was awfully interesting to put a sensor on the water tank up in the roof. The way this particular house worked, there was, water would come. This is pretty standard in English homes. You'd have the water come into the house, and then it would stick around in a big tank up on the top, because that way you actually got decent water pressure, and then it could come down through the house, right? So when we could see when water was coming out of the bottom of the tank, see when it was coming in. So we could measure how many showers people had, because showers have quite a distinctive water signature. This was a very organized house. All of the washing and all of the dishwasher, I think it was put on every morning at 11 o'clock in the morning, because they would come in and everybody would have breakfast. They'd put their dishes in the dishwasher. It was a big house, about 11 people living there. So one breakfast worth of dishes meant one one dishwasher load. So the dishwasher would go on every morning by, I think it was at 10:30. I can't remember what the exact time was. And we could tell what sort of level of disruption there was going on in the house. If the routine of the house was off, then we wouldn't see that dishwasher signature at 11 o'clock in the morning. We'd start to go, okay. So what we were trying to do was manifold. One of the things we were trying to do was try and get a sense for the emotional climate of a home. You know, sometimes you go and visit sort of some friends, and you're like, wow, I really like this place. You know, you can see people at this home, they hang out, and it's really comfortable, and it's a nice place. And then sometimes you go to somebody's house, and it's sort of really, there's sort of all this bizarre, unresolved tension going on, and you can't quite figure out what's happening, and it's all a bit strange. And particularly when you look at sort of shared living environments, how do you know what your partner is feeling when you walk in the door? Right? Can you walk in your door and be able to say, my wife is in a pissy mood. I haven't seen her yet, right? Like, well, what are those cues? And those are the sort of questions that we wanted to ask, was try and get a sense of sort of the affective presence of the home, right? We had a couple of sensors on doors. We had a sensor on the main kitchen table to see how often that was being used. And for example, if it was being used late at night, it meant that people were coming home drunk, and then everyone would convene in the kitchen, and then they'd make fried egg sandwiches, and then they'd leave the kitchen a mess, which meant that the matriarch of the home would be pissed off when she woke up the next morning and found these like fried egg sandwich mess. And this was sort of highly, highly correlated with any use of the table at 2 o'clock in the morning. These kind of stuff. So we did a lot of interviews to get to there. It's somewhat ironic, and we're thinking about this, that to get to the privacy-preserving sensors we wanted, we had to do very, very intrusive questionnaires and very intrusive interviewing these people in real detail. Toby was going back every week to change the batteries on the wireless sensors. So we got a lot of ethnographic reports from that, because he would come back, and by the end of it, they were relatively getting used to it. Some people got really paranoid. Like this one guy who smoked a lot of weed, like a lot of weed. I mean, that was I think his job was sitting around and smoking weed, as far as we could tell. He got really paranoid and actually took one apart at some point, because he was convinced there were cameras in there watching him, which was sort of all sorts of interesting. What we did, the end bit, was to output this data to someone, rather than having sort of a series of bar charts about what we thought the emotional climate of the house was. We took all of this data, and then we generated horoscopes. So I went and scraped something like 75,000 horoscopes off the web. We split them up. I built a support vector machine to recognize them and categorize them in different categories that corresponded to what we thought we could measure. And then it would generate a horoscope for the home every morning during breakfast. And it would sort of spit it out on a little paper tape kind of thing. And then they would flip it over and scribble on it. And like this is appropriate, this isn't appropriate. and they'd sort of write about the different things that they thought about it. So we got this very nice sort of feedback, and it's very communally done. And there's going to be a talk on this at Kaye, Tuesday afternoon at 4:30 in the spirituality session. It's highly recommended. Let's go on to a couple more things. I spent 6 months working as a visiting researcher at Microsoft Cambridge, and we were interested in building technologies for homes in some nice and hopefully interesting ways. They built a thing called the whereabouts clock. How many of you have seen the Harry Potter movies? Yes, we're sort of reasonably. You haven't seen the Harry Potter movies? They're really good. I really like them. Well, anyway. In the Harry Potter movies, Mrs. Weasley in her kitchen has a clock that tells her where everybody in her family is. Right? It points, and it's got home, work, school, and mortal danger. Right? So, and it points to which, so there is sort of a hand for each person, right? And it points to the right one. So we basically built that, sans mortal danger, although there's clearly an affective computing application that we haven't quite come up with yet. We gave people cell phones, and they could program in where they were. So you'd say, okay, you pick up your cell phone, you say, okay, right now I'm at school. And when you went to sort of the other end of school, you say, okay, I'm still at school. When you went to home, you tell it, okay, now I'm at home. And we did this just by looking at the sequence of the cell towers it could see. Right? So if I can see cell tower A at say 98%, and then cell tower B at 50%, and cell tower C at 20%, I've got a certain sequence, right? A, B, C. And it doesn't really matter whether, if I then go and stand behind a sheet of metal, maybe my cell tower A drops to 70%, and B drops to 30%, and C drops to 10%, right? But we found that the sequence was a reasonably good way of telling where people were. And the nice thing is that we could get this kind of privacy-preserving data, right? We got this data back from the system that didn't necessarily impinge on people's privacy, and it was constructed in such a way that it couldn't do that. You know, you couldn't sort of hack into the system and find the actual GPS coordinates of where you were. There wasn't this quite the same temptation to sort of play with the data in the same way. One of the nice things was that people would treat it in terms of the activity. So everybody instantly relabeled this, because just about nobody has homework and school. I mean, that's a relatively unusual thing. So a lot of the families would, so one of the mothers, for example, decided she was going to, instead of work for her was gardening. So she defined both the plot of land, the garden that they had just outside their home as garden, so when she was doing the gardening there, but also they had an allotment, right? They had a sort of small chunk of land somewhere, maybe half a mile away, mile away, where they grew vegetables and stuff. So when she was at the allotment, she also set that up as being gardening, right? Because that was work. And it was this nice thinking about interaction, and particularly thinking about location in terms of the affordances of what interactions it gives you, right? Here's a very good example. Here's a very simple example. Right now, I'm in the same room as you, right? I have a certain location. I have a certain latitude, a certain longitude. If I'm 2 meters on the other side of that wall, suddenly we have a very different situation. If I'm 2 meters that way, it doesn't actually matter, right? I can still have this conversation with you. If I'm 2 meters on the other side of the wall, I can't have that conversation with you. And so thinking about, which sounds really trivial, it is really trivial, but we realize that thinking about location in terms of the technology of where it is, of plus or minus a certain number of meters, turns out to be very difficult. And what actually matters is the affordances that the interaction gives you. The other thing I thought was really nice that came out of this stuff was the ways in which particularly the mums made sense of the data. So the technology was not great. Sometimes it would break, sometimes it would. So we'd be sort of sitting around there interviewing the whole family, and all of a sudden the whereabouts clock would go bong, and somebody would drift off to the outside and be like, oh, who's gone out? Oh, Jimmy, you went out. And then 5 minutes later, bong, and Jimmy would drift back in. And Jimmy was sitting at the table with us the whole time, right? And we were like, well, does it do that often? And the mums would be like, yeah, every now and then. I mean, it happens pretty frequently. Well, tell us about that. And they would say, well, it doesn't really matter because I know what they're doing anyway. And so what was interesting was that they could distinguish between the noisy data, right? Because of their situated understanding of what was going on, they knew when the data was really noisy. They knew that their kid wasn't leaving school at 10 o'clock in the morning, right? But they did know that when at 3:30 their kid left school, that was a real piece of data. And they were sort of waiting and anticipating that. And one mom was particularly proud that her son would come into the home zone about 2 minutes, 3 minutes before he walked in the door, just because that was where the sort of, the edge of the cell towers were. So she could put the kettle on for him, right? And this is, there's a cultural significance to putting the kettle on in England that's like, it means like welcome home and mother's love and things like that, right? Like all like mixed into one. And she loved that aspect of it, right? And it was really interesting the way that what to us was like, oh, we've only got N% reliability. Turned out to be actually something the perceived reliability was much higher than what we thought was the lousy technology. Okay, I want to wrap up a little bit. What I think is interesting about this stuff is it gives us new ways to think about, it makes us realize that when you're thinking about evaluating experience, it's got to be a different way of doing things. You can't do things in the same way. You can't necessarily expect to have same approaches. And hopefully I've given you some ideas of things that I think are currently interesting. I don't know what the answers are, but there's a couple of places that I think we might have some interesting discussions. I'm not sure how many of you will be able to make it to Kai. But in particular, I'd like to mention the SIG, the Evaluating Experience-Focused HCI Special Interest Group, for those of you who are interested in this. And the reason I'm plugging it a lot right now is because it's on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. when everyone's going to be like tired and probably basically hungover from Wednesday night. But if you're going to be there, I think it would be interesting to continue this discussion. I'll also be taking a slightly different take on this, talking more about the history stuff at Alt Chi. And there's the home health horoscopes paper. Excellent. I'd like to thank you all for listening and open myself up to as many questions as you've got, as we have time. Yeah, Scott.
So this is awesome, and
thank you.
And I'm trying to word a question so as to have it be open-ended enough that it's pretty open-ended. And I guess one thing that this raises, I think, really effectively is probably most of us would at some point set up a distinction between design and research, and call them to be at least slightly different activities. And I was curious if you saw that and what it was, and more concretely, do you believe the whereabouts clock or the BIOS system to be research? And I want to leave that kind of open-ended and vague to see.
It's a good question. Let me answer the second bit first, because I think that might be an effective way to get the first bit. I think they are I think they are research, but I think they're research because of the ways that we decided to understand them, right? The people I was working with on this were in particular Barry Brown and Alex Taylor, have a very analytical way of looking at things. And they can be seen as, in some ways, research in this context can be design that you're using as a probe to understand what's going on, right? Because I think the thing about the whereabouts clock is the whereabouts clock itself in some ways doesn't matter. We can take it and we can extrapolate this notion of situation awareness, right, about interaction in location. And I think in that respect it definitely is research. I'm not sure. I don't have the good. I'd love to have a pat answer off the bat for that one, and I don't. But I think you can do this stuff as design, or you can do it as research, and in some ways, it's which way you decide to hold it up at the end. And one of the nice things about evaluation is that you can go into it with this intent of understanding of getting out what you want from it. And I'm not convinced that design and research are different things. I realize this is a sort of difficult room to say that sentence in, and I'll probably pay for it later. But I think there are ways of looking at what you do, and there are particular methods and approaches that people take to doing the sort of stuff that we, broadly speaking, do. It's what you want to do with it is whether you consider it design or whether you consider it research.
if I could just pick up on that question, it seems to me that the issue is, well, what is the knowledge that comes out of the design that you did, really, and the way that you evaluate it and the way that you reflect on it afterwards. And much straight design, maybe there isn't very much generalizable knowledge that comes out of it. But if we think about Donald Schoen's idea that design proceeds by looking at, by having a repertoire of examples, then you can say, well, every example adds to the repertoire. I think that myself, that's rather extreme position to take.
But it seems to it seems to fit the fact. And if you can find a way to, again, another contentious phrase, provide some implications for further design or / research, then I think it gives you a way to talk about that. And I think that's what I like the most about. We'll see if this paper gets into UberComp. If it does, then I highly recommend it. Well, I still highly recommend it to you. But what I think is interesting is the way to take this stuff about a very particular instance of 5 very particular families and really come up with some stories and some ways for understanding that I think really do feed into that repertoire for future design and future research in a very strong way. Yes?
So it's great that you moved back to this slide, because the question I was going to ask was going to move us back to your discussion of location, and in particular this idea of social and interactive affordances of location. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more and relate this idea that you're talking about of affordances of location discovered or perhaps emergent through interaction to the more traditional HCI view of affordances as something that is already inherent in the physical properties.
It's already inherent in the physical properties, but it's going to be situated in a particular instance. And really this is just an idea of situated affordance. And the reason, I think the only thing that makes a difference is that we're specifically talking about location. Because in some ways people, particularly with GPS, soon as you give someone a GPS device, right, they start to believe in this thing called location, right? They're like, this is absolutely where it is. My GPS thing here was just complaining that it couldn't see any satellites when I was putting my stuff out. Apparently I'm not anywhere, right? And and what we're arguing for in this paper is more about a situated view of interaction, a situated view of location as one particular property. And it's related to all the placey spacey kind of stuff, but it's amazing how quickly placey spacey stuff gets lost as soon as you give someone a GPS enabled phone, all of a sudden they start to believe in this particular absolute value of location. And it turns out that there's some more subtlety that we need to think about that and need to be aware of this. And so it was really trying to provide people with this tool of talking about location in interaction to feed into repertoire for future research. Does that answer your question? Ish? Okay. Do you have an argument to it?
Not really. I dislike the idea of affordances of location. That's a larger.
Cool. Let's have an argument about it later. Go ahead.
I just was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your analytical method. I mean, being trained as an ethnographer, this is excellent, but it always looks like ethnography light to me. And one of the things about ethnography...
You mean not real ethnography?
No.
Is it pseudo-ethnography? Sorry, come on.
Is just the thing that I really like about this slide in particular is that it comes from the data much more than it sort of, we're looking for this, et cetera. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you did this and if this is an important part of the next methods. I'm not saying that your work specifically is, but I think a lot of what my field would say of a lot of Kaye work is that it's sort of still trying to sort of put a lens on something and not necessarily look at it sort of in that really thick description sort of way.
Yep. I think that's that's one of the big debates that people are having in the field, and I was only picking on you there, so it does take a very long time, and I think it goes back to Gideon's question about about how you can do something that will feed into the repertoire, right? And you get a certain kind of knowledge out of spending 3 years working on a particular project, right? And there are some excellent examples of doing this in for technology use. I'm thinking about stuff that Heather Horst did recently in Jamaica on cell phone use that she did with Danny Miller. And that kind of long-term stuff definitely has an impact. and is definitely valuable, but it may not be possible in a particular context. And the question then becomes, given the limitations that we've got, how can you maximize the return on the time investment, on the monetary investment? And I think that the tools and the tricks is perhaps not the tools that are presented here give a way to do precisely that, and trying to do balance between the role of the observer, right, and the role of the observed. And there's this sort of basically political side to this, right, about how much weight do you put on the two of these. We have a strong participatory design tradition in HCI, definitely in some areas, and yet what happens when you're actually going into the evaluation of this, and what happens in particular if you don't like what your users do? And there are trivial ways to talk about that, about, oh, my users didn't use the technology properly. That happens all the time. But I also think if you look at it in a critical way, what happens if we've got participatory design stuff, and yet at the same time we're trying to build technologies for a different ethnic group, for a different spiritual group, right? If you look at some work on the role of women in Islam, what does it mean when we're trying to build a certain kind of, to build an Islamic cell phone, right? You can buy one from LG, I think, right now, that points you towards Mecca and sets off a cell phone, sets off an alarm 5 times a day. Okay, that's kind of interesting. What happens if we build a cell phone for Islamic women? All right, that gets kind of, so I think there's ways in which you kind of have to balance back and forth between these things. And in some ways it's easy to present this story of, why don't we do real ethnography? But I also think there's a lot of value in what you get out of this that is a different kind of knowledge. Because we might say, well, why don't ethnographers keep logs? Why don't you log why don't you get their cell phone data and figure out the number of actual minutes per blah, 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 blah. It's got to be, I think probably it boils down to Wendy McKay was right. We have to triangulate in from these different ways. Is that a fair answer? Scott, do you want to respond?
Sure. So I thought that was an excellent question, and there is, if one becomes more open-minded and takes a broader view of what constitutes research activity, it opens the door to the danger of doing second-rate experimental psychology and second-rate ethnography and second-rate computer science. And I think in reading your answer, it would seem that there's a distinct project being undertaken than doing second-rate ethnography.
Yep, I agree.
And so I was interested in having you flesh out a little bit more how your project was at least partially distinct from the ethnographic project.
Yep, that's a good point. I don't think what we were doing was second-rate ethnography, and to present it that is sort of too easy of a get-out, right? What I do think was there are some let's say that we're happy with this this location interaction as an end result, even though Liz doesn't like it, right? Say everybody else likes it, right? How do you deal with the fact that that seems like it's okay, right? You've got an end result that you were, and what you end up doing is a pattern of behavior that you, as a reflective practitioner in this field, have found gives you good results in the past, right? It ends up being, oh, you do what works, and in many ways, I think that's sort of what we're seeing here, right? There's a set of approaches here that are drawing from various aspects, right? So a lot of this stuff is ethnomethodologically informed ethnography. So it's a particular flavor of ethnography. It's a particular approach to what you think you know about when you go in. And it's not 3 years in a mud hut for sure. But I think there is a value in it, and it's not clear to me that you would get the same result if you spent 3 years. But it's not clear that you would necessarily get more. I think you'd get something different. But it's not clear to me that looking just at the time seems like a sort of a strange thing to look at as a particular variable. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that brought that question to mind in the first place was your everybody in every situation sort of slide. And I think that maybe that's...
Which even I admitted was a lie.
Exactly, but maybe that's part of what you get in the sort of 3 years in the mud hut situation versus really the focus on the technology. But I also think it's important to think of think of the situation truly as being beyond the technology, even in a design/research sense. Because it's usually so much more than just that. But
Yep.
Yeah, this is a question of direction, which, and not having read this paper, I can fantasize about what the title means. One way of interpreting it is that this is a probe which the end result of what you learn is about family values. It's not about technology or design. It's that you understand now what they care about because this particular technological intervention has. How much is the goal of research to use the technology as the scientific instrument for some other set of questions? How much is it to evaluate the design?
I think the way I would answer that is I'd point to the different people here. So Alex Taylor, I've spent a long time trying to come up with one of these statements where I can say this is what we're trying to do in HCI and then have everybody in the room nod. And I like to say, when people ask me what I do, like border guards, right, when you're coming into the country, Americans don't get this, but trust me, when you come to this country, you have this little interrogation, you have these sheets of paper and they make you spit into a cup or something, I don't remember. But they say, well, what do you do? And I say, I make computers easier to use, right? And most people, I think, in HCI think that's a reasonably good approximation of what they do. I had a huge argument with Alex Taylor about this. Alex Taylor doesn't care about making computers easier to use. He's interested in using precisely as you said. He's interested in using the technology as a probe to understand what's going on. Whereas Abby Sellen is more interested in actually building the technology and doing it that way. She's interested in the sociological side as well, but really she's interested in the technology. And probably the answer is that the crossover between that is where you get something really interesting. So one of the meaning of values in there, bless you, is indeed one of the meanings of values in there is indeed the sort of finding what the family values, right? Finding what the family values in the clock, but also what the family's own values about what makes them, what are important. Right, so one of the things we found that they really liked, we had one family where they had half the kids were living with their other parent. Right, I could draw it out, but it would take some time and it was relatively complicated. But they really liked the fact that at night, everybody would be home. They might be in different places. In particular, one of the kids defined both his home in the family we were studying and his home in the other family as being home. And they really liked the fact that at night, there was a real value to them and that everybody was sort of, because they were all kind of jumbled together up there in the home section, and they felt there was real value in that. Even though they were physically distant, they felt that it reinforced this sense that they were a family because everybody was home together, even in this sort of virtual way. And then there's some more nuanced stuff, but I can send you the paper if you want. More questions? Or do we have time? You all right?
If you have other questions? Otherwise, you can come up and, come talk to it, but also go to the things of the kind.
Exactly. Right. Thank you very much all for having me. And thank you for some great questions.
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.